Great. So good morning, everyone. Today we have a very interesting session planned out under the HR Roundtable, HR Research Roundtable, hard sessions organized by the Department of Human Resources Management, Faculty of Management and Finance, University of Colombo. So we have Professor Tammar Zilber. She's the head of Organizational Behavior Department and also senior editor of Organization Studies. She's from Hebrew University Business School from Israel. And I'm sure you have done your search already and you would have seen how extensively she had published and she has been cited. I've seen how...
yes, thinking as to what business they are in. Very simple.
Lasantha, you're unmuted.
I will ask.
I noticed that an article because this mission thing is now out of the window, honestly. Right? People are now.
Lasantha.
I've removed him because I couldn't ask him to. Okay. So yes. Her research publications, some of the theories that she has used for research publications are institutional theory, institutional logics, institutional works, and she has published about narrative research and many more. So I invite you, Professor Zilber, to talk to us, to tell us about narrative research and doing narrative research. Thank you, and over to you.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen. Okay, so thank you so much for inviting me. It's really early morning here in Jerusalem. It's 6 o'clock, but I'm a morning person, so I'm very happy to be here with you. I would have liked to be in Sri Lanka. Never been in Sri Lanka, but Zoom is good enough, I guess, for now. So I've been asked to talk about narrative research, which is really close to my heart. My training, I started my training in psychology, narrative psychology, and then I moved to studying organizations and to a business school. So I'm really trying to find any excuse to do kind of narrative research, and I'm happy to talk about that. And what I'm going to talk about is really about the narrative terrain and why to do really narrative studies. Then my focus would be two approaches to doing narrative research. One which I termed a weak narrative approach and a strong narrative approach, and I would exemplify them through two works of my own, just to give you a feeling of how it looks like. And then I will discuss some of the methodological considerations. If you're looking to do narrative research, then what kind of issues you need to consider throughout the research process. And then eventually, I am a senior editor at Organization Studies, and I'm actually the incoming chief editor-in-chief of the Organization Studies. I would be assuming this role in September. So I will take this opportunity to tell you a little bit about Organization Studies and why we would be very happy for you to consider Organization Studies for your publication. So that's my plan, and I'm going to talk about an hour and then leave enough room for questions. I'm happy to get questions throughout the talk or at the end, whatever is convenient for you. So the main thing to say is that we have witnessed in the past 40 years what is termed the narrative terrain in social sciences. And it actually started with psychology, what they call narrative psychology now, and the understanding that people are homo narrans. That means that we are all telling stories all the time. And these stories are very important for the way we construct our identity, we understand the world, communicate with other people. So in cognitive psychology, actually, which used to be very kind of positivistic kind of research domain, they started to understand that really thinking through narrative is very central. And actually, this is the kind of thinking that we all learn very early. And we have to pay more attention to the stories people tell if we want to understand how people think. So that's narrative psychology. So people are telling stories. And then it moved also into sociology and anthropology, understanding these. When we are telling stories, we are not telling them as individuals. Like these are not like really very unique stories that each of us tells, but actually that stories are social. So when we tell stories, we usually tell them to someone. Even if we tell them to ourselves, then we have ourselves as an audience. So we have this idea of tellers and audience. And mostly when we tell stories in social events, like think about the last faculty meeting that you were there and probably some stories were told, then this is really kind of a social process where people negotiate the story rather than just tell stories, full stories by themselves. So narrative sociology is all about this kind of negotiation between people when they tell stories, and how stories are really social achievements and social constructions. And then it got even into economics, where they think that they are doing all kind of the kind of objective kind of stuff with numbers and figures and stuff. But then even in economics, they understood that people have to tell stories about the economy and about all these measures that they're using, and it's not just rational thinking, but also thinking through narrative. So by now we have kind of a very nice studies on how people actually make sense of economics, or how economic decisions are being made through stories. And then eventually it got into our discipline, organization studies, organization theory, thinking about organizations as storytelling systems where many stories are being told, and in decision-making processes, in committees, formally and informally, and again, we have kind of already robust kind of body of research about stories and organizing. So I will be part of that, just trying to figure out what are the kind of research that we're doing within organization studies about narratives. Let me just, but first of all, just a few definitions, because I want to be very clear here. I think many people use narrative as a synonym to text or qualitative research. So when you speak about narrative research, you speak about qualitative research. And actually, I did that myself in this book that I wrote with my PhD advisor and another PhD students when I was still in psychology, doing narrative psychology. And we asked our teacher so many questions, and eventually she said, we should, if you are asking all these questions, probably other people are also interested. So let's write a book about narrative research. But it's actually not about narrative research, it's about qualitative research. So nowadays I would call it a different name. So in this talk, I'm going to use narrative in a very narrow kind of definition. So when I'm saying narrative, I mean narrative or story. For me, in this talk, it will be synonym is, I'm talking about this specific kind of text where you have to have at least these four parts. You have to have, so think about stories, right? This definition is out of literature, really. So usually stories start with some kind of an exposition or orientation. So just to set out the scene, so where we are and when exactly the story is taking place. Then you have to have a plot line, which means that you have to have this succession of events that lead one to the other. So the plot line is really the means by which all these just events happening that have like mere occurrences actually are made into moments within an unfolding story. You have to have some message in the story. People don't just tell stories. They have what is called the point, or the normative point. So there is a message in the story. You're telling the story because it teaches something that you want to convey to your audience, right? And the way you do that is actually that you have to do a lot of selections. You cannot tell a story just including everything, because that it will be a boring, very long and boring, and no one understands the story. No one understands what you're trying to say. So actually, it's not always conscious, but when you start to tell a story and have this idea, maybe intuitive, or you can be reflective about it, what you're trying to convey through these stories, and then you have to select what to get into the story, what to include in the story in order to make this point that you want to make. So we have the orientation, we have the plot line, we have the normative point, and all the selections that we have to do to get there. And also we have characters. So a story is about someone, something that really goes through some kind of process or change or whatever. So you have to have characters, and usually we say at least you have to have a protagonist. That would be the hero of the story, but usually you also have a villain, or a supporting hero. So you can have this, there are all kind of typologies about the kind of characters that you have. So when I'm speaking about narrative in my talk today, this is the kind of a narrow definition that I'm using. So I'm interested to find out what can we do with this kind of texts, not just any qualitative text, but this kind of text. And so not just kind of people talking about their life in kind of reflective way or making kind of lists of stuff. People are actually telling stories with this kind of orientation, plotline, characters, and some kind of a point that they're trying to make. And then I would argue that actually we have two ways, two approaches to doing this kind of narrative research, which is really using stories as the data and using narrative as an analysis of this data. And I'm using here a distinction that Anne Langley did when she wrote about process studies in organizations. And she said there are weak process studies and there are strong process studies. And I'm using her words, weak and strong, relating to narrative. So I would say that we have, and I will speak a lot more about each of these, but we have weak approach where you actually take it kind of loosely what a narrative is, and you are focusing on the content of the narrative. And then we have strong, and this is not meant to be kind of a normative kind of distinction. So I'm not saying that the strong approach is better than the weak approach. It's just that analytically, when I'm speaking about a strong approach to narrative, it means that you're actually using this definition, very narrow definition of what narrative is. And what you're looking at is not only what is the content of the stories that people tell, but actually what is the action that these stories are making in the world, in the organization. So you look at stories as action. So let me start with the, I will actually exemplify these two approaches through two studies that I did. And in these two studies are on the same phenomena and using the same theory. So let me just give you a few kind of the background, the exposition for the stories that I'm going to tell you. So I'm working within institutional theory, which is a theory about the connection between organizations and their environment, the cultural environment. And it takes a discursive understanding of both organizations and environment as, it's these all the ever-going conversation around all kinds of issues. And specifically in these studies, I was interested in the field level. So fields are the inter-organizational space, and fields are really, it's not a place, material place, geographical place, but these are all the people that see themselves as part of this field are part of this ongoing conversation that actually create the fields. So for example, I'm now sitting in Jerusalem, you are in Sri Lanka, but we are all part of this same field, studying organizations theory, organization studies. So this is our discipline is kind of a field. And as long as we feel ourselves to be part of this conversation, then we are taking part in this field, and we actually in this ongoing construction of the field. And specifically, when I was interested in the field of high tech in Israel, and what I did is actually I went to see, I did some field work in high tech conferences. So I'm interested in what we call field configuring events. So this kind of field level event actually configure the field, and conferences is one instance of such events. So people come together, or people that see themselves as part of the field come together, share the same space, whether that would be geographical space or digital space, and then they converse between them. And in this conversation, actually construct and maintain the field. So that was my interest. I was trying to understand what's going on and what can I learn about the high-tech field if I'm going to these conferences and seeing what people are talking about, how they behave, stuff like that. And of course, I studied Israeli high-tech because it's a very well-established institutional field. It's kind of small because Israel is very small, yet it has a very good status within the global high-tech industry. So it's small, but still very significant. And because it's small, it's kind of easier for me to capture it methodologically, because these conferences were actually, these are the main two conferences each year in Israel, and everyone who feels that he parts of the field comes to these conferences. And so for me as a researcher, it was a very it's kind of practical to come to these conferences and to understand and to study the field through the conferences. It was also interesting because this field went through a very harsh crisis. The data that I will present, I mean, the studies that I will present here are based on data that I collected 20 years ago, right? Even more than 20 years ago. So around 2000, where the first boom and then the bust of the high-tech bubble was experienced around the world and also in Israel. So of course, for me as a researcher, that was a good timing because there was this crisis, and then I was able to see how the field tries to understand the crisis and come to terms with the crisis and stuff like that. So what I actually did, and this is really what I actually did, is that I finished my PhD in 1998. I went for a year of postdoc in Berkeley, in California, University of California in Berkeley, and then I came back. I did my PhD in the psychology department. Then I got this tenure track position in the business school. So I figured I have to study something that people in the business school would be happy with. So I thought I would study the high-tech industry. And as it happened, I just started studying with this crisis here. You can see this is the NASDAQ, right? So by now it went up even more, but just think about these, just try to remember if you were there, like these very kind of very dramatic years where the NASDAQ went up and up, and there's a lot of money and hype in the high-tech industry back then. And then suddenly it just collapsed. And this is where I started going to these conferences, trying to figure out what's going on. And as I said, there are two main conferences in Israel each year dedicated to the high-tech industry. And I went to these two for a few years. Like I started in 2000, and then I went for 5-6 years, collected data there. And then starting to work with this data. And I wrote a lot out of this project, many papers also about different kinds of theoretical issues, but also methodological issues about how to do this kind of field level ethnography and what it means and what are the implications and stuff like that. And I would present here as examples just two of these studies. And I'll start with the weak approach. So when I'm saying that this is a weak approach, I mean, it's in psychology, they call it big stories. So this is where you collect whole stories, like the very coherent, big stories. Now, to do that, you actually need to have a situation when it's very clear who is the narrator. So usually that would be interviews. So because when you interview someone, you have enough time and you give them the stage and they can tell, for example, the story of their lives or the story of their career, and you can get the entire story. So the story would be very rich, it would be full from beginning to end, and it would be kind of coherent because the person tells you, they take the time to think what to tell you. And so you have to have a clear narrator. It can also be collecting stories from conferences, for example, that each presenter giving a talk, you can think about that as a story. And because the presenter can speak and no one interrupts in the middle, then you will have this kind of whole coherent story. The stories are loosely defined in the sense that sometimes the people that tell the stories don't really realize that they tell stories. They just give a talk. But we can, when we analyze them, think about this talk as a story. And I'll come back to that in a minute. You can do that from any kind of paradigm. So really, it's kind of paradigm agnostic. You can do it in a positivistic way when you can believe that the stories that they tell are actually objective historical accounts of what actually happened in the past, or you can take a more interpretive or even constructivist stand, understanding that these stories are actually constructions. It's not like people tell you what actually happened. It's not like they're lying, but also stories don't have an historical truth. They have a narrative truth. They have to be coherent, but these are the stories that I tell now, constructing the past from the viewpoint of the present. And then the focus would be on the content of the stories. What can we learn from the content of the stories? So let me just give you this example. So this is one of my own early studies from the project about the conferences. And in this paper, I studied one conference in 2001, and I tried to figure out how these people come to terms with the crisis. So I was there. I recorded every talk. I collected everything that was distributed, all the kind of text and, promo and stuff like that. And I also looked around in the conference. The conference was a day long. So I was there with my research team, and we went to, when there were parallel sessions, someone went to each of the parallel sessions, and we went around the conference space, and we worked field notes and everything. So it was like a very intense kind of ethnographic study, but the conference was only one day. So it was intense, but kind of short. And then I looked at I started reading all the recordings, we transcribed all the recordings, and I started reading what people were talking about. And this is what this is how I came to understand the conference. So you see the columns are 3 different stories being told in the conference. And these are group stories. So this is not specific people telling stories. This is me as a researcher compiling different stories into one kind of ideal story. And I differentiated the stories by who's telling the story. So we have 3 kind of group narrators, and then the rows are different aspects of stories, right? So I'm asking, who's the narrator? Who is the leading hero? Who is the supporting hero? Is there a villain in the story? What is the plot? What is the setting? Atmosphere, what are the emotions conveyed through the story? How the teller established his or her authority to tell the story, and what are the discursive tools that they are using. And what I came to realize after working a lot with these kind of ideas, this kind of analysis, trying to figure out what's going on in the conference, is that there were 3 different stories being told. One of them was kind of the explicit story that everyone told. And then there were 2 counter stories, counter narratives that actually undermine the main story. The main story, like the formal story that everyone told, was like, we have this crisis. No one needs to be blamed for this crisis. I mean, so technology is the hero of the story, and the technology is just great. And we just have this bump now in the road to success. And all of us stand united, trying to get out of the crisis. So this is really a very kind of formal story told to the audience. So, people would still come to work in this industry. So people still put money into the industry, stuff like that, and everything is okay. That's kind of a calm kind of a story. So that was the form of the kind of explicit story everyone told. But then I started looking at kind of jokes people made when they told the story, or the visual kind of imagery that they put on their slides, or kind of anecdotes that they told. And I realized that actually at the same time as they were telling this kind of formal story, they were also telling 2 different other stories. So professional service providers, so the lawyers, the accountant, all these people, actually they were organizing the conference, really. So they told another story actually, and in their story, the entrepreneurs and startup were the heroes, but these were like kind of a clueless heroes who didn't know what actually to do. And the VCs put just too much money into the market, and they didn't do a good selection of where to put their money. And that's why the entrepreneurs really didn't know what to do with themselves and with the money. And this is why we have the crisis. So the crisis really is because of the VCs, and they're just pouring money, stupid money into the market. And the VCs who told this story actually put themselves in the role of the supporting heroes, because they, entrepreneurs that use them and get their help would do better than entrepreneurs who don't. So really the entire story is about, you have to have us. We have the know-how, the business know-how. You may have some good technological ideas, but you have to have us to help you materialize them. So this is one counter story, pointing the finger to the VCs. And then there is another counter story. That's the right-hand column, where told by VCs, and the VCs, of course, didn't see themselves as the villains. They saw themselves as the heroes. The villains were really the entrepreneurs, because they are so clueless and they don't know anything about management and organizing. They just have these nice technological ideas, but they don't know what to do. And then the VCs have to come forth and not just give money, but also give this advice, managerial advice for an entrepreneur to make it. So I thought that, wow, that's a very interesting kind of picture, because you have this explicit kind of story, formal story. Everyone is happy, friendship, we are walking together towards getting out of the crisis. But then actually, implicitly, different groups of people within the conference were blaming each other for what's going on, and trying to position themselves as the saviors. Everyone needs to work with them in order to come and succeed. So just note that people were talking, and I was looking for the stories which may have been kind of implicit in what people were saying. And then I compiled stories into these kind of group stories, right? So I had like maybe 10 different talks by VCs, and then I try to figure out what's similar in the way they are talking. And here's the VC stories, or there were many stories by the service providers, and then I also try to figure out what's similar there. So it's me as the researcher, through the analysis, actually compiling the stories. And I use narrative analysis, means that I went to narratological toolkit, trying to figure out these are the rows, which are the analytical dimensions of narrative that I can use here to try to figure out stories. And I'm using stories here not only to show the content, but also to show that when you tell stories, you can have some kind of a double talk, because you can talk in explicit and implicit level at the same time. Stories are so rich as discursive genre that you can actually have more than one message in a story, and one message can be more kind of explicit, and another one is more implicit. And this is all ideas from narratology that I used here to try to figure out kind of data that I have. I hope this example was clear. Are there any questions or any comments at this stage? Because if not, I will move to the second kind of approach. Okay, so let me move to the second kind of approach, which is a more kind of a strong narrative approach, where you don't just look at the content, but you actually try to figure out how stories are a form of action in the world. So here, usually what we see is that people use small stories. That means that you observe stories in real life in interaction, and then in interaction, usually people do not have the time to tell a full story. Because once they start telling the story, other people chip in and correct them or offer different kinds of understandings, and then actually you have a negotiation around the story rather than you hear full story. So David Bourget, one of the first people who started to do narrative research within organizations, and he termed the idea of the storytelling organization. So he has this very nice paper in ASQ showing how stories being told in organizations are really, I call them terse or partial, very fragmented. Because sometimes we just count that other people already know the story, so we just have to, you remember that story, or people just start negotiate the story from the very beginning. And the definition is much narrower, so people that do this kind of research really speak about stories in a very narrow way, and it's not the researcher that creates the story, it's actually the stories are there in the data. And we're talking about collective ownership and the negotiation between stories. So that's, I would think, the main kind of characteristic of this kind of approach. So let me exemplify this kind of approach with a second paper that I wrote out of the project with a PhD student of mine, a former PhD student of mine, Tammar Zilber. And it just, it's the same kind of data from 20 years ago, but the paper was published just 2 years ago. And this time, it's not the same conference, but it's the same project. These are two conferences being held in 2005 and 2006. And so this is already after the crisis has, they've managed to go out of the crisis. And this one is not high tech, but biotech. So these are two biotech conferences that Tammar was at the time a research assistant of mine, and we went there, and then we came back. She was really, just speaking about what the experience was, and she said, there's something really amazing happened when I was there. I was sitting there in these long rows, looking at this huge stage, and next to me was sitting a person who has a PhD in bio chemistry or something like that. And this was a workshop, and we had to come up with ideas of doing something for the eye. And Tammar, my research assistant, she said, I didn't understand anything of what they were saying, but the person who sat next to me seemed to have a very good idea what was talking about. And she had this solution, like the workshop was, and they were asking people to come up with solutions to some medical problem. And she had a solution, but she didn't raise her hand. She didn't want to speak. And I wondered why it seems like she had this great solution. Why doesn't she raise her hand? And she said, it just seemed like she was afraid, or I don't know, she felt like she wasn't, she didn't have the confidence to come up and come up with a solution. So Tammar came up with, and she said, how come personally, clearly she achieved a lot, and she has this PhD, and she's now working in these startups. How come in this kind of context of the conference, she doesn't feel like she is a success, or she can allow herself to come up with ideas? So this is how this paper came about. We started trying to understand what are the power dynamics going on in these conferences. And we actually eventually understood that the entire conference was working towards convincing the entrepreneurs that they are lacking, that there is something really problematic with them, because their achievements and ideas in terms of like scientific ideas are not enough, because there's something that they don't know, which is the business know-how. And so we tried to figure out, is that something that she came with to the conference, or maybe the conference itself created this atmosphere that people felt like they are lacking something really very, very serious. And of course, the second answer is what we think what's happening there. So we use a narrative approach, trying to figure out how the conference creates this kind of power relations between different actors in the field. And the first thing we did is just look at the story. So this kind of a chart is a little bit more complicated, and we don't have to get into the details, but these, like the rows of 3 different talks being given, 3 different stories being told in different talks. So now it's not group authors, we went through each of the talks, and there were, I think, some 60 talks or something. And we did this kind of analysis to each of them. And you can see the rows of different aspects of the story. So we looked at the plot line, looking at the story world, like the exposition, what is the problem, what is the turning point in the story. We looked at the roles and interactions in the story. So who are the characters in the story? And again, we have the same set of characters that we had in the previous paper. The SPs, the service providers, the lawyers, the accountants, all these people mediating between these startups and the money. We have the VCs, the venture capitalists, the people that actually put the money there. And we have the entrepreneurs. So these are the 3 characters within the stories. And we have these stories really were interesting because they actually told stories with 2 different endings. So they were like saying, the story, here's the story so far, and it can go either way, depends on what you're doing. So we call that the difference between the epic and the tragic story. So each of these talks, each of them about different issues, but when we started to analyzing them for looking at the underlying storyline, actually they all have the same storyline. And the storyline goes something like that. You do something, you have this problem, and now it can go either way. Either it will be an epic story with a huge success, or it's going to be a tragic story and you're just going to fail. And the difference between these 2 stories is whether or not you're using our help and you're using our services, because we will be able to help steering you towards either success. And if you're not taking us, you're going to do, right? So all the stories were told in the same way. So people are telling the stories, and the stories actually have this content that is political, because they actually locate or position different people in different places, different subject positions within the field. So we thought that's interesting. But then once we realized that, we thought, but that is really not enough. So this is a story, but how come people get to tell these stories in the first place? And why do we hear this story all the time? And we actually never hear the entrepreneurs telling any story, maybe a story where they can be the heroes. So we figured out it's not enough to look just at the content of the stories. What we have to think about is how the conference was organized to allow some stories to be told and other stories were actually silenced. So eventually we came to think about that as setting the stage for stories. So it's not enough just to look at what other stories are being told, but we thought we need to understand how come we hear these stories and not other stories. So this is a very kind of a more hidden, kind of less formal power that the organizers have, because they decide what would be the conference theme, who to invite to have an active role on the stage telling stories, and also they decide more or less about the content. Like, they give you just like I was asked to speak about narrative research. Right now I can do anything that I want with that, but I have this general frame that I have to fit into. So it's really by setting the stage for stories to be told that the organizers already enable some actors within the conference to be active, and then silencing other actors. And what we saw here is that the organizers actually invited mainly other SPs and VCs, and we hardly see any entrepreneurs in active roles telling stories on stage. So that already limits the kind of who can tell a story and what kind of stories we will hear in the conference. So now it's not only about the content of the stories, but really about setting the stage for stories to be told. And as we further analyze the stories and the setting the stage, we understood that it's even more interesting than that, because it's not just the setting the stage and the stories told, but actually the conference itself and the way it ran, the unfolding of the stories in real time is like enacting the stories. So the stories that we heard were stories where entrepreneurs were passive, and they have to have the help of VCs and service providers to be successful. And what we saw is that in the unfolding in the event, again, the entrepreneurs were very, very passive, mainly because they were sitting in these long rows, even in kind of workshops where supposedly they were supposed to be more active. They actually were not able to speak because there were so many people in the room, and there were no devices for them to actually, if they were talking, no one would hear them, because everything went through it was a huge room, and you had to have microphone in order to be heard. But also when you look at the kind of activities in the conference, there were plenary lectures with people, just one person gave this kind of a very important talk, and it wasn't like a dialogue. It was just like this this person who knows everything will tell the audience what he or her know. There were some panel discussions, but all the discussions were between the panelists, not with the audience. And as I said, even some events that were called workshops actually were not as workshopy at all, because in none of them people were able, people from the audience were able to speak, and most of the audience was the entrepreneurs. So we came to think about the unfolding of the event as enacting the stories, really enforcing this idea that entrepreneurs are actually very passive. They are passive in the stories, and they are passive in the conference itself. So eventually they all the time hear stories about how passive they are and how much they need the help of VCs and service providers. And then the very experience, the corporal kind of an emotional experience of them in the conference is again that they are passive, and they have no voice, and no one is interested in hearing their stories. So all in all, what we think we saw them is that through the processes of staging stories, like creating the stage for stories to be told, the telling of the stories themselves, the content of the stories, and then the enacting of the stories in the unfolding of the conference, through these multiple modalities, because it's not just cognition that you hear this kind of content of the stories, but it's also material in terms of how the conference space will look like, and it's corporal because it's your body, and you're just stuck there in this line and you cannot speak. And it's also emotional. So all through these three processes and multiple modalities, they're all accumulating into a very specific kind of depiction of the field. So if you sit there in the conference at the end, it doesn't have to be on explicit level, but implicitly, what you understand here, this is the field. The most important people here are not the entrepreneurs with the ideas they have and their innovation. The most important people here are the VCs and the SPs and the entrepreneurs. You need to know your role and your position, and just be quiet. So this is clearly a very kind of political kind of construction of the field, which is relevant to the world of the conference. It's very clear, it's very strong, because it's reflected in all the three: staging, telling, and in acting, and through all these modalities. It doesn't have to be like that. You can think about conferences where people do not accept the role that the conference put them in, and that you can try to resist that and stuff like that. So it doesn't have to be like that. But we think that we have here a model to think through what conferences actually do. And this is a narrative model to understand how events are working. And like, you can think through this model, for example, about the next academic conference that you're going to. So who's staging the conference, who's given an active role, who's giving a passive role, what are kind of stories being told, how the enactment of the stories in the conference itself. In this case, we found that it was very coherent. Everything worked in the same way to create this very kind of a clear political construction of the field, but it doesn't have to be like that. Still, what we are offering here is a narrative model to understand what's going on in conferences, if you think about them through narratives. So what I try to exemplify here is these two types of narrative research. And the weak approach, looking at stories of content. So actually what we did is looking at the stories told in a conference, right? And we focused on the content of the stories. Whereas a strong kind of approach, looking at stories as content, is that we thought about the conference as a story, not looking at stories told in the conference. And we try to figure out how these stories actually created some kind of political depiction of the field. So these stories were working, acting on the world. It's not just like telling, sharing kind of information. It was more than that, looking at the stories as action. So this is the main two. I think you can look through these two approaches on other kind of studies as well. For example, just to give you an example, if you think about narrative studies of entrepreneurship, and there are many of these, you can see like in the left-hand side of these studies that collect life stories of entrepreneurs. So people researchers are interviewing entrepreneurs about their life and how they came to be entrepreneurs. And then usually they just stick with the content of the stories, trying to figure out what were the main events, how the motivation to become an entrepreneur grew and stuff like that. So these would be kind of looking at stories of the past and how an entrepreneur tells their story. And this would be a weak kind of approach to narrative. And then there are these on the right hand side studies about entrepreneurship that actually ask how entrepreneurs tell stories. So entrepreneurs have to sell a vision of the future. There's nothing there, but they have to convince people to give them money and trust them to be able to materialize this vision. So clearly entrepreneurs tell a lot of stories, right? That's the pitch, right? They tell stories trying to convince people. And there are all these very interesting studies trying to figure out what kind of stories are actually convincing and how entrepreneurs tell them, and whether or not telling different kind of stories actually brings different kind of outcomes in terms of the money they actually be able to raise. So think, for example, that this last paper in 2017 with Martins, Jennings, and Jennings, this is a beautiful story where they actually try to show what stories bring the money, right? So what kind of stories the entrepreneur tells, and whether or not when they tell them they get the money. So this is really looking at a strong approach, because they are looking to see how these stories actually affect the stories that the entrepreneur tell about the future, how they affect concrete results in the present. So I could have bring in other examples as well, where when you look about stories and decision making, or all kinds of issues that we study in about organizations and organizing, that we see these two approach, the weak and strong approach to narrative. So why would we bother? Because if you have these two approaches in mind, then they can help you make decisions when you set out to go into the field and collect data, or maybe at the stage of analysis. So I'm thinking, let me just say a few words about the considerations. If you feel like you want to do. So one way is not to decide at the beginning, but just collect the data and then see if you see stories there, then you can use a narrative approach. But there's always the possibility that you can start thinking about that early on when you design a research project, and maybe try to ensure that you would be able to take a narrative approach later on. So for example, when you're choosing a case, right? So even like, are there any stories there? I mean, like when you do like the kind of early on trying to figure out the field and what's going on there, is that the kind of field that you can find stories there? Or when you're thinking about the level of analysis, are you looking for stories told by people on the individual level, just stories people tell about themselves? Are you looking for a group, or kind of social stories where you are looking for interaction between people to see how they come together into agreed upon stories? Are you looking at stories at the level of the organization? So when maybe you're looking for the kind of formal stories organization tell through their websites or PR kind of texts, or maybe you're looking for societal level stories. So where are these stories? Maybe you can find them in newspapers, where maybe you can find them in the national kind of text, stuff like that. So if you start looking through this narrative approach, it can help you decide what level you're looking for and what kind of case would be a good case to focus on. And then, of course, in data collection, say, for example, that I know in advance that I'm interested in stories and that I'm interviewing people. So I would try to make it a kind of a narrative interview where I actually ask people to tell me stories. So, if a person says something, he says, usually I do this and that, and then I can ask, can you give me a concrete example? Can you just, can you tell me more about that? Can you tell me a story that exemplifies what you're saying? Say, tell me a success story, tell me a failure story. So I'm trying to solicit the stories through a narrative kind of interview to be, so I have the stories and then I can analyze them. So if I know in advance that I would like to take a narrative approach, I can think what kind of data collection, what kind of data and how to collect it to be, to try to ensure that there would be stories there. And then, of course, data analysis. As I said, narratology is a huge toolkit of all kinds of typologies of the different kinds of narrative parts, and in there, all kinds of typologies, kind of characters, kind of expositions, kind of genres, stuff like that. If we know that, if we are versed in this kind of literature, it really enriches the way we can look at stories and identify stories and do something with the stories. So if you're doing this kind of narrative studies, it's really advisable to look at narratology. There are already some books that people within our discipline already translated these ideas from narratology into organizations. Look at other people who did narrative studies within our, to see what kind of analytic approach they take for trying to figure out and to analyze narratives. And then, of course, there's also the question of presentation, because there are usually a word limit in what we can write. If you're not writing books and you write articles, there's just a limit of what you can say, how to present the narrative. So you saw here my attempt to present them through tables, to condense all these very rich narratives into kind of tables that will convince the readers that there's something there interesting there. How do you tell stories in the main text? How do you do that? really involved and that would be interesting for the audience, but then still balance between being interesting because you're doing this kind of narrative research, but also be analytic enough so people would understand what's there and how they can use that in their own thinking and theory. So all that issues of how to present narrative studies, it's more generally about qualitative studies. More generally, it's kind of more challenging to write them because of the very firm space limits that we have in writing papers. And then I think two more issues, and then I'm almost done. You better also think about what is really the role of narrative in your project. So it can be empirical, just that you collected stories. It can be methodological when you use narrative analysis and tools from narratology, and it could also be theoretical, right? Because all these, for example, all these papers about entrepreneurship and stories, narrative is really theoretical there because they are saying, it's part of entrepreneurship to tell stories about the future. You have to tell projective stories. And then if you tell projective stories and you tell too optimistic stories, then you're then stuck with the story and you're bound, you're doomed to disappoint everyone because the story you told was too optimistic, for example. So there is all these theoretical issues involved. So there is this issue, how do you pivot from the story you told and what is really the most balanced story that would be visionary enough, but not too visionary and will allow you more space to make changes as you go along and stuff like that. So by now, the use of narrative in the study of entrepreneurship is not just empirical, it's not just methodological, there's theory about that, about how entrepreneurs tell stories and to what effect. So you can also think about what is exactly the role of narrative in your projects and where you want to take it. And the last thing is about fit, and this is really an issue, right, that is relevant to any qualitative research. So I'm not going to say a lot about it, but I'm going to present this paper that was just published and I wrote with Renata Meyer, who is the current editor-in-chief of Organization Studies, and we were teaching a course about methodology in qualitative research in Copenhagen Business School, and then we came up with the idea for this because we were talking with these PhD students about fit, right? So when you do any kind of qualitative research, you have to make sure that all the different methodological choices that you've made about the case, about the level, about the kind of data you collect, about the analysis and stuff like that, all of them have to fit together. So the same goes for a narrative study, right? If you doing narrative studies, you have to make sure that everything, like the theory and the question, really fit for a narrative kind of approach, and everything else, all the other decisions that you've made also fit together to create altogether kind of a coherent whole. And so we tried in this paper to figure out the different kind of choices that you have to make along the research process and discuss how they can fit together or misfit, and then what you can think about that. So I hope we were clear in the paper, and you can read that and see it's not about narrative, but it's about qualitative research more generally. But of course, you can think through this model about your own narrative projects. So it has to be justified. It's not, I cannot say I'm doing this narrative just because I like narrative. It has to be some kind of merit. I have to be able to justify it in terms of the theory, in terms of the research question and all the choices I've made, what kind of data I collected, how I analyzed it, how I presented it, and so forth. So it's okay if it starts just because you want to do narrative research, but eventually you have to be able to justify all your decisions and why taking a narrative approach was the reasonable kind of the right decision to do, given the theory, given the risk question, given the kind of data that you had, and so forth. And we try to come up with this model that will help you go through when you think about your project, and then also when you write it, and how to convince the readers that you took the right decisions, that everything fits together to a coherent whole. I think that's what I had to say about narrative approach, and a two narrative approach. And let me just say a few words about organization studies. The two papers that presented here were published in organization studies. And that's just it so happens, but organization studies is really a special, I think, outlet in the terrain of outlets and journals in our discipline, because it's a very highly ranked and very selective kind of journal on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's also very open to different kinds of writings and different kinds of methodologies. So it's a lot of interesting stuff being published in that journal. It's published by SAGE and EGOS, the European Group for Organization Studies, together. And it aims to promote anything related to organizations, organizing, the organized, and in the context of society at large, right? So it's a very wide understanding of what is relevant. And then, as I said, it's very highly ranked, and it's also very selective. So the journal gets some almost 1,000 papers, submissions a year, and about 2/3 of these would be desk rejected. So we'll not even go into a review process, but then of the other 1/3 would be go out to review by 3 reviewers, double blind, so no one knows who's the reviewers or the writers. And then about 20% of these would be invited to revise and resubmit, and eventually it published around 6 or 8% of the papers submitted each year. So it's very rigorous. The review process is very rigorous, but at the same time, we try to be very developmental and very open to different kinds of writing and traditions. And especially because this is a European kind of outlet and not North American kind of outlet, we also try to be very respectful to different research traditions geographically. So we really try to be open to people coming from different places. You know, myself, I'm coming from Israel. It's really a periphery. It's not part of Europe. It's not part of North America. So it's a different kind of research tradition, but organization studies tries to be very open and inclusive to different traditions. And we publish very different kinds of articles. Of course, the main genre is really research articles that are based on empirical kind of data, right? But we also publish what we call perspectives, which are kind of introductions to virtual spatial issues, where you give an introduction and understanding of an entire theoretical terrain. We have essays where you can discuss all kinds of ideas more generally in a more kind of innovative way. We have some methodological papers, so we can discuss methodology, and we also have book and media reviews. So we really hope, I'm happy for this opportunity to bring this journal to your attention, and we will be very happy to see submissions and hopefully work together towards publication. That's it.
Thank you very much, Prof. Zilber, for that very useful, very interesting session. So now the floor is open for questions, clarifications, additions, anything? Yes, Paitami.
Thank you very much. And I know it was 6 o'clock when we started, so thank you for being so early, punctual, and sharing your knowledge with us. So I must confess, I'm a positivistic researcher, but I have meddled in with qualitative research, but not as extreme as narrative, but more interpretive. So my questions might seem a bit stupid. Because I'm coming from the positivistic mind frame, my questions are, so I have 2 clarifications to ask from you. So the way you were talking about those 2 examples from the conference research, as well as I quickly went through, sort of looked at the structure of your paper on the bubble, IT bubble. So it seems to me that if you do research on using narrative form, when you write your papers, and also, I suppose it's part of the analysis, there is more involvement or more interpretation by the researcher than the usual thematic coding we use, the usual interpretive studies. It's more you create the story. So there will be more of your voice in the paper than the other qualitative studies.
Yeah, I think it's a great comment. So I see myself not only as a qualitative researcher, but really coming from a constructivist understanding. So in this kind of understanding, anyone, also people doing positivistic kind of studies, actually construct what we're not merely studying something, we actually construct what we study as we study it. And so, yes, I'm very active as a researcher. I'm active, I'm compiling the stories, but still I have to do that in a very rigorous, systematic way. And I have to be able to convince the readers that there's something there. It's not like I can sit at my desk and just imagine things. I'm going out there, I'm collecting the data, and then I have to do something that is true to the data in a way. So yeah, I think it's right.
My second clarification was, now, again, going back to the previous, those two examples of based on the conference, your so-called respondents or whose stories you took were sort of everybody who attended the conference. You said even the parallel sessions, you made sure there were people listening to the parallel session. So in those two examples, your participants, your storytellers were all those who attended, right? But the examples you gave about the entrepreneurship studies, what basis did the researchers select the entrepreneurs? Because we usually use purposive or network, whatever. Is there any different way of selecting participants in narrative research? Thank you.
That's a good one. So I think it depends on your approach. Some of them come from a more positivistic kind of understanding, and then they do this kind of purposive sampling or maybe theoretical sampling to make sure that they cover a specific terrain or population that they want to cover. Some of them just use, I don't know how to call it, practical kind of sampling, where, for example, some of them, if you go to a conference, it's just that these people are in the conference. So if you cover all of them, or some of them, I think, are based on hubs of entrepreneurs or entrepreneur training courses, then you would have those people that applied and are there in the training session, then this is your data. So I think each of them are going a different way, justifying why they are studying this. I would say more generally that if you're doing that from a positivistic kind of approach, then what you are trying to figure out is how can you study this sample and then say something about the population, right? And that's why you have to have the right kind of sample. But if you do it from an interpretive or even constructivist approach, then my goal is not for statistical kind of generalization, but more what we call analytic generalization. So I'm not trying to say that every conference, like this is a sample of conferences, and then I can say something about the entire population of conferences. I'm not trying to say that. What I'm trying to give you is an analytic kind of lens to think through the next conference you are going to. So we call that an analytic generalization. So I'm not saying anything about conferences. What I'm saying is that you can take this analytic lens, thinking about conferences as the unfolding of stories, and then see whether this is fruitful to your thinking about whatever it is that you are studying. So when you are aiming towards analytic generalizations, the issue of sampling is much less significant to your ability to say something eventually, because you are not trying to come up with generalizations from a sample to a population. Does that make sense?
Yep, Thank you. Thanks.
Yes, Wendy.
Sorry. Thank you, Professor Zilber, for the wonderful session. It was so insightful. I just want to ask a question about you mentioned about 3 types of papers that can be written using narratives. One is empirical, the other is methodological, and the third one is theoretical. About methodological papers, how can we use narrative analysis or narrative method to form a methodological paper? Would you be able to give an example for this?
Okay, so I think I may have been misunderstood. It's not like it has to be 3 different kind of papers. It's the role of narrative in the paper that you are writing. I was relating to in an empirical paper that you write, the role of narrative can be either that you use that as a theory. For example, if you are studying entrepreneurship pitching, so that you use narrative now theoretically, because by now we have a theory about how these stories act in the world within entrepreneurship. So, or you can use narrative as a methodology. For example, if you're saying, I did these kind of narrative interviews, I collected narratives, and then I just did a content analysis on them. So the collection of data was narrative based, but then the analysis eventually would be not narrative, and then you would not use narrative any further within this project. And so it can be theoretical, it can be methodological, and it can be empirical, where you're saying I'm focusing my data is narrative, and now I'll do something with narrative. So that's what I meant when I used that. However, there are also methodological papers about narrative, which are papers that try to figure out how to use narrative. Like I could have turned this lecture into a paper, right? And say, here I'm looking at stories, at narrative studies. I see that we have 2 approaches. I think there are a few, for example, review papers about narrative and how to use it, or you offer this kind of narrative analysis. So you're saying, here are the kind of analysis you can do with narrative, and offer a few examples. You can write a methodological paper if you want. But what I was trying to synthesize, I'm thinking when you do a narrative study, you have to be very careful thinking how exactly you use narrative. Is it just methodological, just theoretical, just empirical, or maybe you do all 3 of them?
All right, okay. Thank you. Would there be a paper that you would recommend for such, that you have for a methodological, a role of that they have used for in such an instance?
That's a good question. I don't think we have that within our discipline, that you actually do just narrative methodology. There are books, or maybe there are. So look for David Bourget, B-O-G-J-R-E. He has some stuff about, he has this diamond kind of thing, it calls it diamond methodology. There is a paper about Yanis Gabriel, book. There's a book also about narrative research. Baba Czarniawska from Gothenburg University in Sweden. She also did some, she has some, I think, books about narrative research.
All right. Okay. Thank you, Professor. Thank you so much.
Prof. Zilber, a question from me. I've recently read about this narrative variant of narratives, composite narratives. What is your take in that, and how is it accepted as a methodology or a way of doing research?
I think it's very well accepted if you can explain how you did it and why you did it, and justify why it's okay to do it. Also, it's always very helpful if you can show that other people already did that. So it's not like you are inventing the wheel of it. There is a tradition, and you are, joining a tradition. So I think I saw many papers with this kind of composite, like the first paper that I presented here. Yes, that people do that, and if you can explain it, and that's okay. Just accept it that that it's kind of hard to work with this kind of little, and you can put them together yourself as a researcher.
Thank you. And also, now I suppose in composite narratives, you can actually look at a number of individuals because you'll be composite, you will be collating their stories and writing their stories and doing the analysis. But if it's otherwise, how many generally would be, how many people's stories should you tell generally for you to have a very good narrative study? Some say that it should only be very few. Some say you can even go to 10, 15, 20, whatever the number. So how would be the number would be?
That's a good question. It really depends. So if you're just doing interviews and then you composite the stories from that, I think these days you would have to have probably 30, 40 interviews minimum for people to be convinced. I'm not sure. I generally think we collect too much data and then we don't know what to do with all that data. So I think it's better to have less data, but they can really get into it. But I know that because our discipline is kind of varied and there are many people that are not versed in qualitative research, that there is this minimum amount of data that they want to see. So I would say if your unit of data is interviews, then maybe you have to have more interviews. I can tell you that I have a paper now under review, second round in Administrative Science Quarterly, and in that paper I use 10 instances of decision making, only 10. So this is not a narrative, right? I'm using narrative analysis, but my unit of data is 10. So it's not 10 interviews, it's not 10 meetings. It's like 10 issues that had to be decided upon in the board. And they're okay with it. These 10 are, each of them is like a few, many, a lot of text around each of them, but then it's only 10 and they never said, 10 is not enough, because it depends really, it depends on what you're trying to say and how rich the data is. So what I would say that instead of thinking about how many interviews, you have to think through what is your unit of data. So if your unit of data is stories, so how many stories do you have there? If your unit of data is some kind of a recurring event that you want to look at, so how many events do you cover? So for example, I studied this one conference, but in this conference, there were maybe 30 occurrences of stories. Then I have 30 units of data, not one unit of data, which is the entire conference. So I think thinking about not only what is the object that that you are looking at, but also what is the unit of data that eventually you are using. So maybe you have 30 interviews, but in these interviews, there are 100 stories being told. And then it gets much more convincing to say, I have 100 units of the data that, occurrences of the unit that I'm interested in. So I hope, is that helpful? I hope that thinking through the unit of data. Okay.
Thank you. Any other questions from others?
Professor, I'm a doctoral student from University of Colombo. I have two questions. The first one is, I would like to know whether you could shed some light with regard to how one should do an interview guide as opposed to the other guides that we are quite used to. So I'll ask the second question later, Professor.
Okay, so you're asking how to do a narrative interview?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So a narrative interview, I have two pieces of advice. One of them is that you can take a kind of a holistic kind of narrative approach when you ask people to tell you the story of their lives. So say you are interested in something that they're doing now in their work, but you really want to locate that in the entire story of their life. And then what you do is you come and you say, like we have this kind of technique when you say to a person, you can write a book about each person's life, and then you will have different chapters to that book. If you were to write a book about your life, what would be the chapters? And then you give them this piece of paper with chapters and the name of, please write the name of the chapter and from what year to what year and stuff like that. And then you start the interview by them filling out this form. So what are the chapters and what are the name of the chapters and when they start and when they end. And then you go with them through each of the chapters and you can ask a set of questions about each of these chapters, depends on what you're interested in. But say very generally, you can ask, tell me a story about this chapter. What kind of person were you? Who are the important people in your life, significant people in your life in this chapter? Why did you give this chapter this title? And why did you end the chapter where you ended it? Say, and then I go through each of the chapters and I ask the same kind of set of questions on each of the chapters. And then eventually I get to where we are today. And then I can ask all kinds of questions, which are not narrative questions about the issue that I'm interested in. But I find that usually if you ask people that for their entire story, then usually you would have like interesting stuff going on early on that actually connects what you're interested in right now. So that would be one, but this can take a long time. So usually this kind of narrative life story kind of interview may take 6-7 hours. So that means that you would meet with this person for 2-3 meetings, right? So that's really a very long one. If you don't have time for that, or you don't think that would be very fruitful for what you're studying, then what you can do is that just ask for a lot of stories. So for example, say you are interested in a person working now in a specific profession. So you can start the story, start the interview by asking, can you tell me how you got to this job that you're doing right now? And then when you ask this kind of very broad question, then the person have to decide where to start and what to tell you. And all these decisions that the person is doing about the story that he's telling you are indicative. You can then use them to interpret it, what he's telling you, right? So whether he started like a month ago, whether he started in his childhood and what was his childhood dream, all kinds of different people are telling all kinds of different stories, and then you can work with the stories. And then each time you ask a question, you can ask, tell me like, what is your relations with your boss? Can you tell me a story that exemplifies your relation with your boss? What would be considered a good day for you? Can you tell me a story about a specific day and what happened then and why you think that was a good day? What do you consider as a failure? So tell me a story about one time that you failed in something that you wanted to do. And if people start talking, kind of in principle, ask them, can you tell me a concrete story? Can you give me an example? So one way is to really ask for all the story of their lives, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that. You can also do a narrative interview by being very consistent in asking people to tell you stories. Tell me something. Instead of saying, all kinds of kind of slogans, can you be more concrete? Can you tell me a story? Can you give me an example? And then you can ask stories, you can ask questions about the story. So who was there to help you? How did you feel? What happened next? So with the kind of questions that you are asking, you are conveying your interest in stories, and people usually respond to that. So if they really feel that you are listening to them and that you think that their stories are significant, then they would tell more stories.
Thank you, Professor. So basically what you meant is like to related to strong narrative approach, basically to dwell on small stories kind of approach is what you are
Yes.
saying is what
Yes. You can use I'm sorry, I see the sun is in my face now because it's you can do a regular interview, but just asking more and more and more, again and again for stories.
My second question is, Professor, what did you mean by partial, fragmented?
Okay. So this is usually not in interviews, because in interviews, people do tell full stories because you give them the time, you give them the stage, so they tell the story. But if you think about stories being told in board meetings or staff meetings in an organization, and just sit in the next meeting that you happen to be there. People usually don't have the time. The audience it doesn't give them the time to tell full stories. And then when we collect stories in real life in organizations, what we find is that usually these are partial stories. Maybe because people already know the stories, and then you just say, do you remember what happened then? And then people, yeah, we all remember. So you don't have to tell the story. So this is an occurrence where stories is presumably being told, but actually people do not tell the full story because everyone knows the story already. Or it's because someone starts to tell a story and then someone else says, sorry, this is not what happened. Something else happened. And then they start telling two different stories about what happened, and they try to argue, was it like that or was it like that? So usually in real life, in organizations, in families, stuff like that, you don't get to tell a story from beginning to end because other people will chip in either to support your story or to offer a counter story or to argue with you that you didn't get it right and something else happened, stuff like that. So this is why David Bourget actually did this story this study where he actually collected stories being told spontaneously in day-to-day life in organizations, and he showed that these stories are partial and fragmented.
Thank you, Professor.
Sure.
Professor, one question from me. Just want to know how does it differ from narrative analysis to be different from a case study? Is it the breadth or the depth that you study on a case study versus narrative analysis?
Sorry, I didn't understand. What's different from what?
Yeah, the difference between narrative analysis versus case study. Is it because of the depth that you study in a case study or what?
Yeah. I think it's a good question. So when you study one organization, it's a case study, but within the case study kind of tradition, you can still take a more kind of narrative approach or not, right? Because you can do a case study without any narratives. So I think these are just different kind of levels or traditions coming together. If I study one conference, if I study one organization, it's also a case study, right? But if I'm doing that from a narrative perspective, then I'm adding that to the mix. Does it make sense?
Yes, thank you very much. Yes.
Any other questions?
Finally, Professor, is there a special paper or that you could recommend for data analysis with regards to narratology?
I am not aware of a paper that that review everything, but I would say there are a few encyclopedia to narratology. I think there's one by Cambridge and there's one by Routledge, where you have very short entries on different issues about narrative, and then you don't have to read it from cover to cover, but you can read about analyses, you can read about plots, you can read about, and then, so I have these two in my office. I don't have them here, but I consult them. So there are dictionaries. I don't remember whether it's called Dictionary to Narrative or Encyclopedia of Narrative. Surely there's one by Cambridge, there's one by Routledge, and I just use them whenever I need as like the entry point into what's going on. That's one thing. The second thing is that if you are thinking of doing a narrative, then I would look for papers that actually did that already. And then if you can find a paper that helps you think about your data, and then you could also mention the paper, say, I'm following this paper, because that way you signal to the readers that there is a tradition that you are following. So that's another way to go about it. So when I'm trying to do something, I'm looking for papers that do something similar in terms of the data that they have, and then I try to figure out what they're doing methodologically and whether that would be helpful.
Yes, Professor. Understood. Thank you so much.
Sure. And if you don't find them, please send me an email. I'd be happy. I just don't have the books here, but if you send me an email, I'm happy to give you a more direct reference to these two books that I'm talking about. the encyclopedia and the dictionary.
Thank you very much. And I think we've come to the end of our session. So thank you very much for that very interesting, thought-provoking, and very informative session on narratives. I know there are a few here in the audience who are thinking of doing narrative research. So I'm sure for them especially, it will be a very useful session. And thank you, Mayuri Atapattu, for recommending Professor Zilber for us and for getting me to organize this session. And thank you, the audience, for being very interactive. Thank you very much. And I will end the session by inviting you to Sri Lanka to experience our wonderful country. So if you ever think of coming to Sri Lanka, do let us know. And we are more than happy to help you, with anything related to your visit. So with that, I will end the session. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much.